The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Women and Peace and Security, Sexual Violence in Conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedures, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Dr. Danis Mukwege, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Ms. Caroline Artem, Director of South Sudan Women with Disabilities Network. And Ms. Birgit Attinger Collins, Senior Women Protection Advisor, United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2021/312, the report of Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, and document S/2021/333, a letter dated April 5th, 2021 from the Permanent Representative of Vietnam, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Ms. Pramila Patten.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, today's meeting is a critical opportunity to take stock of both the persistent and entrenched, as well as new and emerging challenges in our collective efforts to eradicate the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. Building upon our debate last year, which focused on turning commitments into compliance and pursuing a survivor-centered, rights-based approach in all prevention and response efforts, we now meet to assess and address the gaps that remain. Many of these gaps and challenges have been exacerbated over the past year by a pandemic that has arrested the attention of the world. Concerted efforts are needed to ensure that survivors of sexual violence are not obscured beneath the long shadow cast by this unprecedented crisis. In that respect, I would like to sincerely appreciate the leadership of Vietnam for convening this debate, which shines a spotlight on the issue during dark and difficult times. I warmly welcome the civil society briefer from South Sudan, as well as our senior women protection advisor from the Central African Republic, and Nobel laureate Dr. Danis Mukwege, whose first-hand frontline perspectives will enrich our search for solutions. Mr. President, we meet at a moment when this crime, which should have been consigned to a closed chapter of history, is once again in the headlines. In the remote mountainous regions of North and Central Tigray, women and girls are being subjected to sexual violence with a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. Healthcare workers are documenting new cases of rape and gang rape daily, despite their fear of reprisals and attacks on the limited shelters and clinics still in operation. The report before us records allegations of over 100 rape cases since hostilities erupted in November 2020. It may be many months before we know the full scale and magnitude, the extent and impact of these atrocities. There is no question that this Council has adopted groundbreaking resolutions to combat sexual violence. But the question could be asked, what do these resolutions mean right now on the ground in Tigray? When history looks back on this painful episode, as part of the long litany of battles fought on the bodies of women and girls from Bosnia to Rwanda, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, we will rightly be asked what we did to honor our commitments. For its part, my office has engaged with the authorities at the highest level to offer technical assistance and support, and will continue to closely monitor the situation, calling for restraint, humanitarian access, service provision, and effective investigation. Mr. President, the chasm between resolutions and reality, between aspirations and operations, is also evident on every page of the 12th annual report of the Secretary General before us today. This report covers 18 country situations and documents over 2,500 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in the course of 2020. As in previous years, the vast majority of these incidents targeted women and girls, 96%. Reports of sexual violence against men and boys were recorded in almost all of the countries examined, with the majority occurring in detention settings. 8 verified cases were found to target LGBTQI individuals. While such figures convey the severity and brutality of verified incidents, they do not reflect the global scale or prevalence of this crime. The chronic underreporting of wartime sexual violence due to stigma, insecurity, fear of reprisals, and lack of services has been compounded by COVID-19 containment measures. Lockdowns, curfews, quarantines, fears of contracting or transmitting the virus, mobility restrictions, and limited access to services as shelters closed and clinics were repurposed for the pandemic response, all added a layer of complexity to existing structural, institutional, and sociocultural barriers to reporting. Proactive measures to foster an enabling environment for survivors to safely come forward and seek redress have become more urgent than ever. Many survivors have broken their silence, but many others have been broken by the silence forced upon them. Shame, isolation, rejection, and the anguish of having nowhere to turn has shattered lives and livelihoods. Alongside the data, the report also surfaces human stories. The mother and daughter in eastern DRC who fled a rebel attack on their village only to be raped by government soldiers arriving to fight the rebels. The displaced families who live in constant fear of being forced to marry their women and girls to armed elements in the Central African Republic. The girl who was gang raped by 4 armed men in Tripoli, whose family refused to file a complaint due to social norms around honor, shame, and victim blame, coupled with fears of retaliation. The adolescent girl who was gang raped by 3 soldiers as she harvested fruit near a displacement camp in Darfur. The survivors of ISIL captivity who were forced to abandon their children conceived as a result of rape due to a lack of social acceptance. And the Bosnian woman who was raped in 1995 and is still seeking redress for the physical and psychological trauma she endured. Each of these cases cries out for justice. The survivor-centered approach articulated in Resolution 2467 demands that their voices be heard and heeded in policy and programmatic decisions, that they be treated with dignity and provided with quality multi-sectoral assistance, and that they be seen by their societies as the holders of rights that will ultimately be respected and enforced. Protection is tied to participation and power, yet this is imperiled by a global political climate of pushback on women's rights and shrinking civic space, evident in a disturbing trend of misogynistic attacks on women's human rights defenders and reprisals against women who are vocal and visible in public life. At a time when the Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire to focus on defeating this disease, COVID-19 has given rise to new gender-based protection concerns. The report records cases of sexual violence against women detained for alleged violations of curfews and quarantines, as well as violations by armed groups that have taken advantage of the pandemic to intensify their operations and gain ground. The report makes a case for survivors' rights, needs, and voices to inform national response and recovery plans as part of fostering a more equitable post-COVID era. At the same time, the report recognizes that the UN system, service providers, and civil society organizations swiftly pivoted to virtual approaches, such as hotlines, remote case management, and new referral and coordination networks, thereby avoiding a data blackout. Despite these innovations, many of those hardest hit by the overlapping crises of conflict, displacement, and COVID-19 have also been hardest to reach, notably in crowded displacement settings where access to information and services is scarce and women are forced to navigate the gender digital divide. Marginalized women tend to be left further and further behind in times of crisis and social stress. To bring the structural root causes of sexual violence into focus, the report views the issue through the lens of intersectionality, ensuring that survivors are not simply treated as a homogeneous group. It demonstrates how intersecting forms of inequality based on ethnic or political affiliation, age, disability, sexual orientation and gender identity, income and migratory status increase the risk faced by diverse individuals in the context of historical power asymmetries, which are structural and systemic. The report illustrates the nexus between sexual violence, conflict-driven trafficking in persons, and violent extremism, which requires cross-border cooperation and regional response capabilities, notably in the Lake Chad Basin, where the ongoing Boko Haram insurgency exacts a heavy toll on women and girls. While some patterns of conflict-related sexual violence transcend national borders, others persist at the subnational level. The intensification of entrenched, localized conflict is a concerning trend that perpetuates cycles of sexual violence, including in the context of tensions over Transhumance corridor in the Central African Republic and Sudan. Community-based militia have used rape, forced marriage, and sexual slavery as part of identity and resource-based conflicts in the DRC, Somalia, and South Sudan, though this rarely features on the radar of global security bodies. The lack of service coverage in isolated areas due to weak state presence and infrastructure has become all the more acute during the pandemic. The report calls for sexual and reproductive health care to be designated as an essential service in order to avoid its defunding and deprioritization in light of the painful lesson from past epidemics that more women die from a lack of access to reproductive health care than from the disease itself. In rural and remote regions, the distance to health structures is vast and transportation is limited, preventing many survivors from accessing care within the 72-hour post-rape window needed to prevent HIV, STIs, and unwanted pregnancy. Service delivery and material assistance cannot be dismissed as a secondary issue for security stakeholders, but is in fact the ultimate expression of political will. Meeting the basic needs of survivors and communities at risk doubles as a form of protection against exploitation and abuse. Greater attention must be paid to the risk of desperate families resorting to harmful coping mechanisms, such as early and forced marriage, in response to physical and financial insecurity. As a critical pillar of prevention and deterrence, the report calls for enhanced efforts to close the accountability and reparations gap. While important developments took place at both the national and international level in 2020, such as the trial and conviction of notorious warlords Sheka and Lionso for war crimes, including rape in North Kivu, and the first conviction by the International Criminal Court for the crime of forced pregnancy against a member of the LRA. In other cases, investigations were stalled and prosecutions paralyzed owing to COVID-19 restrictions. Although committed on a widespread and systematic scale by terrorist groups, sexual violence has not been prosecuted in the context of counter-terrorism trials. This means that no legal precedent has been set recognizing victims of sexual violence as legitimate victims of terrorism on a basis of equality before the law. In terms of transitional justice, momentum was observed in South Sudan, where the authorities announced the establishment of the African Union Hybrid Court. Last month, the Iraqi Council of Representatives adopted the Yazidi Survivors Law, which provides support for victims of ISIL's atrocities. My office has also developed model legislative guidance on conflict-related sexual violence to assist states to harmonize domestic laws with international standards. The report notes that in some cases, the adoption of protective legal frameworks stalled, not only due to COVID restraints, but following opposition from traditional and religious leaders, as seen in Somalia. This highlights the need to mobilize a broad constituency in both the formal and informal spheres to promote social change. While reparations have been awarded in many cases, they generally remain unpaid, leaving victims empty-handed, even as illicit arms and revenue flow into the hands of the perpetrators. This year's report lists 52 parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations on the agenda of the Council. Over 70% are persistent perpetrators, having appeared on the list for 5 or more years without taking remedial or corrective action. It is critical to ensure greater coherence between the practice of listing and the practice of levying targeted and graduated measures by sanctions committees. If applied in a timely and consistent manner, sanctions can change the calculus of parties that operate on the assumption that rape is cost-free or even profitable in the political economy of war, in which women are trafficked, traded, and sold. Sexual violence does not occur in a vacuum, but is tied to broader security dynamics, such as the resurgence of hostilities, the rise of violent extremism, arms proliferation, population displacement, and collapsed rule of law. These factors trigger renewed patterns of sexual violence, which the report finds to be concentrated in contexts of abduction, captivity, displacement, detention, in the vicinity of military bases, in private homes during raids, at checkpoints, and in rural areas where women undertake livelihood activities. All tools must work in tandem to protect civilians at risk, support survivors, reform security sectors, and compel compliance by parties. This comprehensive approach is reflected in the 11 joint communique and frameworks of cooperation that my office has signed with conflict-affected countries to anchor national ownership. The most recent is the framework of cooperation signed with the government of Sudan in March 2020, which includes efforts to address sexual violence as an integral part of the broader political and democratic transition. In all contexts, it is critical to emphasize that policies of zero tolerance cannot carry zero consequences. Mr. President, distinguished Council members, building back better in the wake of this pandemic requires an inclusive, intersectional, and gender-informed approach. Let us not miss or misunderstand this moment. This is not just a point in time. It is a turning point in history. The pandemic demands a paradigm shift to silence the guns and amplify the voices of women, to invest in public welfare rather than the instruments of warfare. We need to shift the leadership paradigm to ensure the representation of women and survivors themselves. We need to shift the public spending paradigm to reduce military expenditure and strengthen institutions. And we need to shift the security paradigm to foster human security and resilience to social and economic shocks. The pandemic has laid bare the intersecting inequalities that plague our societies, as compounded by conflict, displacement, and institutional fragility. The only cure for these overlapping ills is an injection of political resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge. It is not the time to return to the status quo, but rather to dig deeper and tackle the root causes of this problem as never before. From Tigray to Tripoli, from the Kivus to the camps of Darfur, women across the world look to this council to realize the vision set out in its 10 transformative women, peace, and security resolutions. A gender-responsive global pandemic recovery is everyone's business. It is unfinished business, but it cannot be business as usual. It is time to write a new social contract in which no military or political leader is above the law and no woman or girl is beneath the scope of its protection. It is time for decisive action to mitigate the risk of sexual violence before it has begun. As history has taught us, prevention is the best and only cure. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Patton for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Dr. Dennis McWich.
Merci, Monsieur le Président du Conseil, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Madame la représentante spéciale du Secrétaire général pour les violences sexuelles liées au conflit, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants des États, Mesdames et Messieurs, je tiens à remercier la mission de Viet Nam aux Nations Unies pour m'inviter à prendre la parole à l'occasion de ces débats ouverts sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. L'année 2020 a été marquée par le 20e anniversaire de la résolution 1325 et l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité du Conseil de sécurité. Nous saluons le fait que notre lutte pour la dignité des femmes survivantes des violences sexuelles est à l'ordre du jour de la communauté internationale et que la question des violences sexuelles liées au conflit gagne enfin en visibilité auprès de responsables politiques et des décideurs. Néanmoins, les avancées du droit international ne doivent pas occulter le fait que le fléau de la violence sexuelle, qui est une véritable pandémie, continue de prévaloir dans tous les contextes de conflit. En outre, les réponses restent sous-financées et le climat d'impunité pour les crimes à caractère sexuel demeure toujours davantage la règle que l'exception. Mesdames et messieurs, nous sommes encore loin de l'établissement d'une ligne rouge contre l'utilisation du viol et des violences sexuelles comme stratégie de guerre, de domination et de terreur. Ainsi, notre combat pour un monde dans lequel chaque femme et chaque fille ont le droit de vivre à l'abri de la violence se poursuit, car l'écrasante majorité des victimes ne reçoivent toujours pas l'assistance et le soutien dont elles ont besoin, ni obtiennent la justice et des réparations pour les atrocités qu'elles ont subies. Le grand défi que nous devons relever aujourd'hui réside dans la mise en œuvre effective du cadre normatif existant et dans la traduction de nombreux engagements pris par le Conseil de sécurité en des réalités concrètes au bénéfice des survivantes. C'est dans ce contexte que nous saluons la détermination du secrétaire général et de sa représentante spéciale de transformer les engagements pris en obligation et les résolutions adoptées en résultat. Nous avons pris acte de cette volonté exprimée dans diverses recommandations figurant dans un récent rapport du secrétaire général visant à combler les lacunes de la stratégie globale de la lutte contre les violences sexuelles et à mettre en œuvre concrètement les mesures prises dans l'agenda paix et sécurité. Parmi ces lacunes, c'est à juste titre que le secrétaire général, d'ailleurs, dans ses rapports, avait fait le constat amer que pendant les 10 premières années d'existence du mandat instituant un représentant spécial pour les violences sexuelles liées au conflit, aucune personne ou entité ayant perpétré des actes de violence sexuelle n'a été visée par des sanctions décidées par le Conseil de sécurité précisément pour ces motifs. Ainsi, nous saluons le fait que le Conseil a imposé des sanctions au chef du groupe armé 3R, Retour, Réclamation, Réhabilitation, en République centrafricaine en août 2020 pour avoir planifié, ordonné ou commis des actes de violence sexuelle, y compris des viols. Nous aspirons à ce que ces précédents importants ne restent pas un cas isolé, car chacun reconnaît que les efforts de redevabilité et de justice sont les meilleurs outils de prévention. Tant que ces crimes odieux ne seront pas punis et sanctionnés, ils se poursuivront. Pourtant, c'est le maillot faible de toutes les stratégies visant à répondre aux violences sexuelles et à dissuader les potentiels auteurs et les chaînes de commandement politiques et militaires de commettre ces actes barbares qui font tout simplement honte à notre humanité commune. Je réitère donc mon appel à la communauté internationale et aux États à tracer une ligne rouge contre l'utilisation du viol et des violences sexuelles comme arme de guerre. Une ligne rouge qui serait synonyme de listes noires, des sanctions économiques, financières et politiques et des poursuites judiciaires contre les auteurs et les instigateurs de ces crimes odieux. Mesdames et messieurs, en République démocratique du Congo, nous poursuivons, ici à l'hôpital de Panzi, où je me trouve, nos efforts pour répondre aux violences sexuelles liées au conflit selon un modèle d'assistance holistique basé sur 4 piliers, médical, psychologique, socio-économique et légal. Ce modèle de One Stop Center, centré sur les survivantes, a pour objectif d'intégrer dans un même lieu tous les besoins liés à la santé de la femme dans sa globalité, au sein d'un système de soins de santé primaire pour éviter la discrimination et la stigmatisation. Mais il ne s'agit pas que de répondre aux conséquences de la violence. Il faut avant tout prévenir la non-répétition des crimes en renforçant les efforts de lutte contre l'impunité. Les victimes ont non seulement droit à des soins holistiques de qualité, mais aussi à la justice, à la vérité et à des réparations. Diverses résolutions du Conseil de sécurité ont mis en lumière que l'impunité dont jouissent les responsables présumés des crimes les plus graves, notamment à caractère sexuel, a été et reste l'un des principaux obstacles à l'instauration de la paix et de la stabilité en République démocratique du Congo et explique en grande partie la perpétuation des atrocités de masse jusqu'à ce jour dans les provinces en conflit de l'Est du pays, notamment à Ituri et dans le Kivu. Telle est la raison de nos efforts de plaidoyer pour mettre en œuvre les recommandations du rapport Mapping sur les violations les plus graves des droits de l'homme et du droit humanitaire commises en République démocratique du Congo entre 1993 à 2003, l'une des périodes les plus sombres de l'histoire moderne de notre pays, pendant laquelle les femmes et les jeunes filles ont payé un lourd tribut et toutes les forces combattantes congolaises, étrangères, ont eu recours de manière massive, méthodique et systématique au viol et aux agressions sexuelles comme stratégie de terreur et d'asservissement. Pourtant, plus de 10 ans après sa publication par le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies pour les droits de l'homme, aucune recommandation de ces rapports visant à la mise en place de tous les outils de la justice transitionnelle n'a été mise en œuvre. Ce qui est particulièrement choquant face à l'ampleur et la gravité des crimes commis à l'encontre de la population civile depuis des décennies, et ces crimes se poursuivent jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Mesdames et messieurs, nous tenons à attirer l'attention des membres du Conseil de sécurité sur le fait que les solutions politiques et militaires ont jusqu'à présent échoué à amener la stabilité en République démocratique du Congo et à assurer la protection des civils. Alors que les autorités congolaises et les Nations Unies ont entamé des discussions sur une stratégie de retrait graduel et progressif de la MONUSCO, il nous semble primordial de mettre la lutte contre l'impunité et le recours à tous les mécanismes de la justice transitionnelle au cœur de cette stratégie, en mettant l'accent sur la nécessité de prioriser une profonde réforme du secteur de la sécurité et les poursuites judiciaires par la mise en place des mécanismes internationaux ou des mécanismes internationalisés de poursuite et de jugement des crimes les plus graves. Je vous remercie pour les actions que vous allez entreprendre pour mettre fin à l'impunité et soutenir la mise en œuvre d'une stratégie holistique de justice transitionnelle en République démocratique du Congo. Cet impératif de justice représente un prérequis indispensable pour briser les cycles de violence et de l'insécurité et une condition sine qua non pour avancer sur le chemin d'un développement et d'une paix durable. Ensemble, nous pouvons mettre fin à la violence sexuelle et agir pour la dignité humaine, la justice et la paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank Dr. Markwich for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Caroline Atim.
Thank you so much. Mr. President, Excellency, civil society colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. Thank you for this opportunity to deliver this statement on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. I am Caroline Atim, Executive Director of Southern Women with Disability Network, an organization working with women with disability and also working with the survivors of gender-based violence. Today, I speak on behalf of these survivors as well as women and girls with disability. I am a deaf woman. My sign language interpreter will be voicing my statement today. Despite the peace deal, South Sudan remains engulfed by intercommunal, ethnic, political, and armed conflict, where gender-based violence is deliberately used as a tool of humiliation against women and girls. More than 65% of South Sudanese women have experienced sexual or physical violence, a figure that doubles the global average and among the highest in the world. A little combination of impunity for perpetrators and deep-rooted inequality and discrimination means that sexual violence against women and girls is not taken serious as a crime. Even before the current conflict, rape in marriage was considered acceptable, and more than 50% of girls married before they turn 18. The situation has only worsened due to the conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic. Survivors are often forced to marry their relatives. This inhuman and unjust practice must end. Mr. President, globally women and girls with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience gender-based violence, abuse, and exploitation, especially during conflict, as they face increased isolation, lose access to support networks, may have limited mobility, or can be left behind. Let me share the example of a young girl whose heartbreaking story illustrates the suffering of women and girls with disabilities. In 2014, a deaf 14-year-old girl was raped several times. After being abandoned by family members who fled the fighting in Bor, she was unable to communicate her trauma to anyone or seek necessary health service in the immediate aftermath. When I met her and was able to communicate with her in sign language, we were able to understand what happened to her and provide her with immediate care, only to find out that she was HIV positive. Had she had access to an interpreter and timely medical care, she could have been helped sooner. But these necessary services were not available to her, and she had to suffer in silence. This is unacceptable. This story illustrates how the suffering of women and girls with disabilities is compounded by the discrimination they already face. They are easy prey for rapists who know they act with impunity because women with disabilities, even more than others, may not be believed if they report this violence. They often struggle to access limited or inadequate health facilities, safe shelter, or even basic health and legal information. The COVID-19 pandemic has made these conditions even worse due to lockdown and interruption of services. And yet, response to gender-based violence often neglects the specific needs of women and girls with disabilities, and very limited data is systematically collected about our experience, including by the United Nations. Instead, there is lack of understanding of our rights, combined with stereotypes that we cannot make choices for ourselves and that our perspectives do not matter. In situations where survivors of sexual violence bear children, both the children and the women who bear or raise them can face stigma, discrimination, and devastating consequences due to the deep-rooted gender inequalities. These women often ostracized by their communities and abandoned, leaving them with few resources and long-lasting physical and psychosocial trauma. The only way to address the tragedy of these women and girls and their children is to address the prevailing inequality and protect their fundamental rights. The rights, experiences, and voices of survivors must be at the center of any response to gender-based violence. This includes survivors with disabilities. Survivors have fundamental rights that entitle them to services according to their specific needs. They must have access to comprehensive, accessible, and non-discriminatory services, including psychosocial, sexual, and reproductive health and rights, mental health care, access to legal services, and training to develop livelihood skills. This is what a robust survivor center approach looks like. Currently, the widespread availability of firearms in our highly militarized society leaves women at the risk of all forms of gender-based violence. The sale of illicit weapons must be stopped to ensure women's safety. Perpetrators must be held accountable through the hybrid court, which should be established and fully functional in accordance with Chapter 5 of the Revitalized Peace Agreement. All parties must prioritize the full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership of women in all of their diversity, including those with disabilities, in all aspects of the current peace process, and ensure that the 35% quota provided in the Revitalized Peace Agreement is met. South Sudan must respect its human rights obligation and all the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2475 on persons with disabilities, and also those on women, peace and security. Mr. President, we need an end to war and violence in South Sudan. The lives of thousands of South Sudanese women and girls cannot be traded away for a momentary break from fighting. If their suffering is forgotten, our wounds will never heal. We need inclusivity, justice, and reconciliation with the past. The Security Council can and must fulfill its obligation to the people of South Sudan and to the many women and girls in conflict around the world, to whom it is committed to ending once and for all forms of gender-based violence. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Atim for her special briefing. Also thank the translator. I now give the floor to Ms. Belkis Attinger-Collins.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you for the invitation to speak at this important event. I'm greatly honored. Today, exactly 1 year ago, I left Bangui on board the last commercial flight to Europe as a prevention measure due to the COVID-19 pandemic. With me were many colleagues from international organizations and some of those that provide medical services to victims of sexual violence. At that time, the prediction was that the weak health system would not be able to deal with a general outbreak of COVID-19. Now, 1 year on, the official number of COVID cases in the Central African Republic stands at 5,682 confirmed cases, with 5,112 recoveries and 75 deaths. Within the UN family, we counted 749 cases and deplored 6 deaths. Early summer of 2020, most of us who had left returned to the country and resumed their work in the field. Internal flights have long since resumed and humanitarian services continue to operate. With testing rare, COVID-19 looms over the country with an unknown magnitude. The general population does not wear masks and motor taxis carry multiple passengers. Despite continuous sensitization carried out by the mission, there is no social distancing outside the work environment of international organizations. The virus seems a neglected enemy in a place where so many other challenges exist. I've served in MINUSCA for over 5 years, and unfortunately the COVID-19 crisis we witness is not the only one affecting service provision for victims of grave human rights violations, including sexual violence. Over the past 5 months, the National Army and bilateral forces carried out military operations against armed groups, in particular against those that formed the Coalition des Patriotes pour le Changement, ahead of the first round of presidential and legislative elections in December last year. Numerous installations of humanitarian organizations were destroyed or occupied by combatants, and hospitals were looted, bringing service provision to a halt. Humanitarian access to many regions have become from risky to impossible due to the numerous thefts of vehicles and bridges being deliberately destroyed. These violent clashes in many parts of the country contrasts with periods of hope and positive developments. On 27th of December, I joined many of my colleagues to observe the election day in Bangui. It was amazing to see the thousands of people streaming to the voting centers, queuing patiently, sometimes for hours, to cast their ballots. And all of the women I talked to were keen to assure me that it didn't matter how long they had to wait, as long as they would be able to exercise their civic duty and vote. In March, during my field visit to Bambari, the women's associations there assured me that they continue to support survivors of sexual violence, despite the fact that their office building could not be used. They had stored all their equipment at a safe place as a preventive measure before the armed groups had invaded the town in December. As Senior Women's Protection Advisor, my role is to advise and support MINUSCA's civilian, police, and military components in implementing the mandate to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. In my work, I have come to understand two crucial areas that define the extent of the response to conflict-related sexual violence. One is the social obstacles that impede survivors from reporting violations. The other concerns access to justice. In March, two NGOs reported the following, I quote, "One of the most common forms of violence suffered by adolescents, which has continued to affect the latter during the recent armed crisis in Bouali and Damara, is sexual violence. The attitude of indifference of the community towards this problem appears to further fuel the impunity enjoyed by the perpetrators. In the current crisis situation, this is exacerbated by insecurity and hunger." End of quote. Bouali and Damara are less than 100 kilometers north of Bangui. In more rural areas, other barriers prevent survivors of sexual violence from seeking justice. This includes stigmatization, rejection by the family and community, and reprisals by the perpetrators. In the majority of the locations outside Bangui, there is no functional chain of justice, with courts inoperational and prosecutors absent. Equally, in large parts of the country, access to health facilities is difficult or impossible due to weak infrastructure. At this point, I want to speak about some of my most inspiring encounters with civil society and survivors of sexual violence. Our mandate spells out the role of civil society and community leaders in enabling access to services for survivors and shapes our support to partners. While the mission works to strengthen the justice system in the long run, there also has to be a focus on immediate remedies for survivors. One of the first is to restore their dignity. As one NGO partner said to me, "We want to show them they are not alone, that there are others in such situation, and give them something they can do to improve their confidence." Last year, I visited a project in the north of Bria in the center of the country, developed by MINUSCA's Community Violence Reduction Program. Men and women, some of them survivors of sexual violence, were tending to their plot where they grew vegetables. The women did not want to speak about the violence they had suffered, but they did proudly show me the growth of their plants, the prospect of some income, and personal independence. Income-generating activities to regain control of one's life during the long wait for justice. Traveling in the field can mean you spend 5 hours for a few kilometers of distance. But roads are the veins of the country, which bring support from the centers to the isolated areas. Where the population has no means to travel, regular visits of the mission and humanitarians connect them to essential services. On our way back from the farming project, our convoy was stopped in a small village along the axis. The village chief was waiting with the father of a girl, a victim of rape, who had walked over 15 kilometers to reach the main road, waiting for us to pass so he could report the crime. I reported the case to UNPOL, which then initiated an investigation. And while that region still awaits the re-establishment of courts and state authorities, our programs and support to local partners are the first steps to hear victims, provide assistance, and restore their sense of confidence and belief in a future where impunity will give way to justice and development. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Colleen for briefing. And I now give the floor to those members who wish to make their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much for convening this very important debate. I want to also thank the SRSG for her remarks and her comments, and thank all of the briefers for your interventions today. And it's really great to see you, Dr. Mugwege. It's been a while since we've seen each other. The United States greatly appreciates the work of the UN on this issue, and in particular, the work done by the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. We are extremely proud of our continued support for the SRSG's office and our contributions to this office to help facilitate their important work, and we strongly encourage other member states to provide support. Around the world, sexual violence is used as a deliberate tactic in armed conflict, whether to terrorize, destabilize, or break bonds within communities. That makes conflict-related sexual violence a security issue and a human rights issue, and it demands collective action. In particular, right now, the Security Council needs to pay attention to deeply disturbing reports of mass sexual violence occurring in Ethiopia's Tigray region. We as the Council must address reports of women being forced by military elements to have sex for basic commodities and reports of sexual violence against women and girls in refugee camps, among other horrific information. The international community must work to ensure that all those involved respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And the international community must establish immediate protection mechanisms, humanitarian aid, and other needed services for survivors. Independent, credible investigations must be conducted to hold perpetrators of these and other human rights abuses and violations committed in Tigray accountable. And in Burma, where the same military leaders responsible for a campaign of sexual violence in Rakhine State have now returned to power, women and girls across the country are facing even graver risk. Of course, gender-based violence is a crisis around the world. 1 in every 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in her lifetime. That is beyond a crisis. That is a calamity. The pandemic has made the situation even more dire. Social isolation and financial desperation have led to a spike in gender-based violence this past year, especially intimate partner violence and violence against girls. So I'd like to talk about 3 ways we can address this emergency. First, we can help prevent sexual violence by elevating women and putting them into positions of power. It is absolutely essential that women fully, equally, and meaningfully participate in peace and security processes. After all, women make the world more peaceful, and that is not anecdotal. That is a fact. By promoting women's participation in leadership in politics, in mediation, and in negotiations, we promote more security and peace. And by doing that, we will help prevent sexual violence and conflict from ever happening in the first place. Second, the best way to address gender-based violence after it happens, especially when it's used as a weapon of war, is to take a survivor-centered approach. That means providing survivors with access to medical care, particularly clinical management of rape, psychosocial support, and sexual and reproductive health services. It also means providing survivors with social support and legal services, all to create a supportive environment in which a survivor's rights are respected and the survivors treated with dignity and respect. For our part, President Biden has committed the United States to providing sexual and reproductive health care and services for women around the world, especially women who have been impacted by conflict-related sexual violence. Third and finally, we must pay special attention to underexamined and underreported forms of sexual violence. In many places, for example, the LGBTQI plus community faces outsized levels of sexual violence. We must more closely examine what can be done to safely identify survivors and provide necessary support for this community, particularly medical care and psychosocial support. Also underreported and underexamined is the impact of sexual violence on men and boys. In Afghanistan, for example, the terrible practice of bachabazi, the commercial and sexual exploitation of boys, is well documented as occurring within the security forces and is exacerbated by the country's conflict. The scourge of sexual violence must be eradicated in all of its forms, especially as a weapon of war. Speaking more broadly on gender-based violence, the United States has called the increased rate of violence over the last year the shadow pandemic. Well, I'd say it's time to bring gender-based violence out of the shadows. Together, we have to work to shine a light on it. And let's treat this like an emergency with the urgency that it demands. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，中方感谢越南举行今天的公开辩论会。我也感谢秘书长特别代表 Patton 女士和各位通报人所做的通报，他们的看法和建议有助于安理会更好地讨论和处理这一重要问题。新冠疫情之下，武装冲突、恐怖主义活动并没有按下暂停键，人道主义和安全危机有增无减。秘书长最新报告指出，性暴力仍被用作战争和恐怖主义手段，冲突局势中的妇女首当其冲，深受其害。中方坚决反对将性暴力作为战争手段，强烈谴责任何对妇女和女童实施性暴力的行径。中方呼吁国际社会高度重视，综合施策，早日消除冲突中性暴力，推动妇女和平与安全事业不断取得新进展。第一，要着眼治本，在预防冲突、维护和平方面加大投入。古特雷斯秘书长曾在报告中强调，打击冲突中性暴力议程的最终目标，不是让冲突中没有性暴力，而是让世界没有战争。只要冲突和战乱还在持续，性暴力就可能成为战争和恐怖主义的手段。国际社会应当着力解决根源性问题，彻底铲除冲突中性暴力的滋生土壤，遵循不干涉内政、不诉诸武力等原则，坚持以和平方式化解争端。安理会应积极推动政治解决热点问题，在预防冲突、维和等方面发挥更大作用。冲突各方应切实响应和落实联合国秘书长全球停火倡议，通过对话协商解决分歧。第二，要促进性别平等和妇女赋权， 支持女性在经济社会发展、和平与安全领域发挥更大作用。冲突中性暴力问题不是凭空出现的，它往往反映了性别不平等、发展不充分等深层次矛盾。新冠肺炎疫情对冲突地区带来了严重冲击，妇女处于更为弱势的地位。国际社会要在妇女赋权和发展的总体框架下，统筹应对冲突中性暴力问题，致力于消除性别歧视和性别差别待遇，推动妇女事业和经济社会同步发展，与2030年可持续发展议程实现协同增效。要继续支持女性更广泛、更深入地参与和平进程，开展斡旋调解，提高女性参与决策的能力、机会和发言权。第三，要坚持当事国主导，支持当事国努力。当事国对预防和打击冲突中性暴力、保护本国妇女儿童负有首要责任。国际社会应鼓励和支持当事国根据本国国情推进妇女和平与安全议程，采取打击冲突中性暴力的有力行动。要在尊重各国主权和司法管辖权的基础上，帮助当事国加强安全、司法等领域的能力建设。联合国相关机构应当基于各自授权和专长，开展工作，用好用足现有资源，加强协调，形成合力。要支持区域和次区域组织发挥独特优势，鼓励探索基于本地区实际情况的方案和实践，要引导妇女团体和民间社会发挥建设性作用。主席先生，妇女与武装冲突问题是北京宣言和行动纲领所列12个重点领域之一。作为第4次世界妇女大会东道国，作为性别平等和妇女赋权事业的倡导者，中方将继续同国际社会一道努力，为早日消除冲突中性暴力、推进全球妇女事业发展做出更大的贡献。谢谢你，主席先生。
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to all of our briefers for their compelling and informative testimonies. The UK is proud to be a partner in this vital work. Sexual violence is a feature of conflict in countries around the world, but we're particularly concerned about the credible and widely corroborated reports of rape and sexual violence in Tigray. We urge Ethiopia to work closely with the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict to address this. Caroline Atim's briefing reminded us too of the disproportionate impact of gender-based violence on women and girls in South Sudan. There have been ambitious commitments, but little peace dividend for women and girls in South Sudan. We look to South Sudan to expedite the establishment of the hybrid court and to partner with the UN to deliver justice. In these and other post-conflict situations, survivors carry the effects of their trauma, while perpetrators most often walk free. So first, I want to underline the UK's commitment to tackling sexual violence in conflict. We are the only country with a Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict, with a dedicated team and funding. Since 2012, we've committed over £48 million to supporting survivors, tackling stigma and reducing impunity, supporting projects across 29 countries. Second, I want to emphasise, as we've heard from our speakers, the importance of a survivor-centred and human rights-based approach which prioritises the rights and needs of survivors. That includes the right to accessible sexual and reproductive healthcare services and access to justice, which take into account the specific needs of victims and survivors living with disabilities, LGBTQI individuals, and other at-risk groups. The UK has committed £1.3 million to the Global Survivors Fund, run by Dr. Mukwege, which works to ensure survivors of conflict-related sexual violence have access to reparations and other forms of redress in conflict and post-conflict countries. In the last year, the UK has also launched 2 key tools to support survivors. First, last June, Lord Ahmed, the Prime Minister's Special Representative, launched the draft Murad Code for global consultations. This is a code of behaviour for those collecting evidence to respect survivors' rights and ensure investigation is safer, more ethical, and more effective. And second, last November, Lord Ahmed inaugurated the Declaration of Humanity by faith and belief leaders, which calls for the prevention of sexual violence in conflict and denounces the stigma faced by survivors, including by children born of rape. Finally, alongside supporting survivors, we must do all we can to ensure accountability for the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. As the SRSG said, zero tolerance cannot have zero consequences. The recent UN Security Council Resolution 2564, sanctions against Sultan Zabin, demonstrated that the international community can and will take action against perpetrators of torture and sexual violence in conflict. But there is more we can do to strengthen accountability for these crimes in UN-supported international and hybrid criminal courts and tribunals so that perpetrators are justly prosecuted. As we've heard, there are millions today who are affected by conflict-related sexual violence, survivors, children born of sexual violence, families, entire communities. I thank the Presidency for convening this debate and our briefers for highlighting the problem and what can be done. I assure you of our continuing support to end the use of sexual violence in conflict and as a weapon of war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente, México agradece a Vietnam por la convocatoria a este debate, así como al secretario general por la presentación de su informe, cuyas recomendaciones endosamos. Mi país ve con gran alarma e indignación la situación que detalla el informe sobre el incremento de la violencia sexual asociada con los conflictos y su recurrente uso como táctica de guerra, represión y tortura por grupos armados, estatales y no estatales, que han aprovechado la pandemia para seguir cometiendo atrocidades. Mi país, México, condena la muy grave situación de violencia sexual que observamos en muchos de los conflictos actuales, ya sea en Etiopía, en República Democrática del Congo, en Somalia, Sudán y Sudán del Sur, por mencionar solo algunos lamentables casos. Los confinamientos y cuarentenas han exacerbado significativamente la violencia sexual y de género a nivel global. Si a ello sumamos el impacto diferenciado en las mujeres y niñas que resulta de la amplificación del poderío de quienes controlan las armas y que perpetran actos de violencia sexual con impunidad, el resultado es simplemente devastador. Resulta imperativo, señor presidente, atender la correlación entre la proliferación y el tráfico de armas ligeras y pequeñas y la violencia de género, que muchas veces resulta en violencia sexual, tanto en situaciones de conflicto como de posconflicto. Si bien contamos con marcos y mecanismos para prevenir y atender la violencia sexual en conflictos, incluyendo el mandato de la representante especial, falta mucho para hacer para transformar las normas sociales que perpetúan la dominación patriarcal, la discriminación sistemática, los prejuicios, la desigualdad de género y la estigmatización de las víctimas. En la prevención y atención a la violencia sexual, debemos poner en el centro de nuestros esfuerzos y toma de decisiones a las sobrevivientes, mujeres y niñas, pero también hombres y niños y personas LGBTI, para garantizar la prestación de asistencia legal, médica y de subsistencia económica con base en necesidades particulares y con un enfoque de derechos humanos e interseccional que tome en cuenta las múltiples barreras que enfrentan según su origen étnico, edad, estatus migratorio, condición de discapacidad, orientación sexual e identidad de género. Más aún, considerando que los traumas y efectos psicológicos pueden ser agudos y también pueden deteriorar la salud mental y el bienestar psicosocial de los sobrevivientes. Debemos incorporar en las labores humanitarias el acceso a este tipo de servicios y de manera amplia a todos aquellos de salud, incluyendo los servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva, no solo como labor preventiva, pero como pilar en la reconstrucción del tejido social. Las mujeres y niñas con discapacidad deben ser un grupo prioritario en el acceso a estos servicios. A todas las víctimas de violencia sexual perpetrada por grupos armados y o terroristas, debemos reconocerlas y garantizar su acceso a la asistencia multisectorial, a la reparación y al resarcimiento del daño, procesos que deben ser diseñados e instrumentados conjuntamente con las víctimas, asegurando su acceso expedito a sistemas de justicia efectivos, independientes, imparciales y con enfoque de género. La falta de rendición de cuentas por parte de los perpetradores y la impunidad de la que gozan contribuyen a la repetición de la violencia sexual y a la vez a una falta de confianza y miedo de las sobrevivientes a denunciar. Por ello, son urgentes los marcos jurídicos e institucionales que garanticen mecanismos de denuncia, investigación, enjuiciamiento y castigo de los culpables. Señor presidente, el Consejo de Seguridad tiene la obligación de hacer uso de todos los recursos a su alcance para prevenir y atender este flagelo. Es indispensable que los comités de sanciones continúen incorporando la violencia sexual como criterio para la imposición de sanciones a los perpetradores. Pero estas seguirán teniendo un alcance limitado si no se refuerzan mediante la cooperación y el intercambio de información con otros órganos, como son el Grupo Informal de Expertos de Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad o el Grupo de Trabajo de Niños y los Conflictos Armados. La violencia sexual en conflictos armados es un crimen de guerra, como está asentado en el Estatuto de Roma y ha sido confirmado por la jurisprudencia de la Corte Penal Internacional. El Consejo de Seguridad debe remitir a la Corte las situaciones en las que se cometan estos crímenes a fin de que no queden impunes. Importante también resulta incorporar disposiciones específicas de prevención y respuesta a la violencia sexual en las renovaciones de los mandatos de operaciones de paz, así como aumentar el despliegue de asesoras de género. Finalmente, reconocemos el papel esencial de la sociedad civil, de las mujeres constructoras de paz y de las defensoras de derechos humanos en la prevención y atención de la violencia sexual en los conflictos y contextos humanitarios, a menudo brindando servicios que no proporcionan los estados, y nos comprometemos, señor presidente, a su protección ante los ataques y la violencia de la que son víctimas en el ejercicio de su encomiable trabajo. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kenya thanks Vietnam for convening this open debate and all the briefers for sharing their diverse perspectives. We also welcome the Secretary General's current report on conflict-related sexual violence, particularly the focus on frameworks of cooperation with specific country and regional mechanisms. Mr. President, Kenya strongly condemns gender-based violence and its manifestation in sexual violence in all contexts and all situations. Kenya supports the upholding and strengthening of protection against gender-based violence, including under international human rights law. Kenya is currently undertaking its second phase of implementation of the WPS National Action Plan. Kenya calls for the Security Council and the international community to support regional efforts against conflict-related sexual violence. In particular, we call on the Council to note and support the outcomes of the ministerial level meeting of the AU Peace and Security Council that was held on 22nd March 2021, chaired by Kenya, on the theme Women, Peace, Culture, and Gender Inclusivity in Africa. The resultant communique, among others, underlined the need of building the required infrastructure to provide medical and psychosocial care and trauma healing to victims and survivors of SGBV and all other violations in conflict settings and countries emerging from conflict. It also urges all member states and partners to invest in awareness programs to sensitize communities on the available support and structures for victims and survivors of trauma aimed at addressing stigmatization. The United Nations should and can support the implementation of such infrastructure, particularly in conflict-fragile member states. Regarding the Security Council framework on WPS, Kenya welcomes the progress made in the advocacy and evolution of the normative framework addressing conflict-related sexual violence. Allow me to make two observations in regard to gaps and opportunities with the SVC agenda. First, the gendered impact of interstate conflicts needs more attention, particularly where conflict-related sexual violence has the resultant effects of early marriage, girls dropping out of school, forced displacements, increased refugee and IDP living situations, and threats to local women peace builders. This calls for strengthened coordination with communal and religious leaders and the work of the PBC. Second, WPS Resolution 2242 recognizes that acts of sexual and gender-based violence are part of the strategic objectives and ideology of certain terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram. The Secretary General's current report makes specific reference to the link between sexual violence, trafficking in persons, terrorism, and violent extremism. For instance, the report cites efforts by the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund project in Somalia in support of women formerly associated with Al-Shabaab, many of whom being survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. In view of these observations, we wish to make the following recommendations. 1. Resolution 2475 that underlines the rights and protection of women and children with disabilities in conflict situations needs to move from a disability needs-based approach to the operationalization of full, equal, and meaningful participation of women with disabilities in leadership and decision-making at all levels. 2. The protection pillar should encompass not only the protection of women, but also the protection of the grassroots and national gains achieved by women in peace negotiation processes. 3. We need to incorporate sexual and gender-based violence as a separate listing criterion with concurrent targeted sanctions against specific perpetrators in the mandates and sanctions regimes that do not have such language. 4. emphasize effective coordination between early warning mechanisms and national and local community leaders to mitigate against information and reporting gaps. 5, strengthen a survivor-centered approach that factors in all victims and comprises timely reporting of offenses and accountability and prioritizes medical, psychological, psychosocial, and economic support in alignment with Resolution 2467. And finally, pursue a stronger integration of the WPS counterterrorism and countering violent extremism agendas to ensure accountability of perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict situations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, and I want to thank you for convening today's really important debate, and in particular for ensuring that we have had such strong voices from civil society informing us in our briefers this morning. To Caroline, Atim and Dennis McQuaggy, thank you. Thank you for being truth tellers of the reality of sexual violence, a reality all too often shrouded in stigma and obscured. Your focus on empowering survivors helps them to regain the sense of agency that these violations so horribly undermine. I also want to pay tribute to Special Representative Patton. Your work in documenting the evidence of these heinous crimes and calling to account their perpetrators makes an enormous contribution. It serves to elucidate our understanding. Importantly, evidence-based reporting reinforces our ability to address impunity. Today's work of documenting crimes will lead to tomorrow's convictions. Your work is badly needed and deeply appreciated. I was especially pleased to hear from Beatrix, the Women's Protection Advisor working with MINUSCA. In our view, ensuring the adequate resourcing of women's protection advisors from regular missions budgets is crucial. This council has an obligation to follow through on the promises we make in the establishment of mandates. This absolutely includes women protection advisor posts. To assume our clear responsibilities, we should expand their deployment. Mr. President, the Secretary-General's report warns of the risk that COVID-19 will reverse hard-won gains on gender equality, reminding us that inequality is a root cause and a driver of sexual violence in times of conflict. Of course, it's a driver in peace times too. Let's be clear, to eliminate sexual and gender-based violence, including in conflict, our most fundamental task is to achieve gender equality at every level. We should not fool ourselves that the shocking sexual and gender-based violence in times of war, disease, and disaster is somehow extraordinary or aberrant. Let's not fool ourselves that things will go back to normal once the crisis has passed. What we witness in times of conflict and crisis is the transfer of violence from the private to the public sphere. We see the deliberate weaponization of the gendered violence that 1 in 3 of us who are women will experience in our lifetime. Most of the violence is suffered by women and girls from men they know. This is a kind of normal no woman wants to return to, the kind of normal we cannot afford to return to. I echo therefore the words of the Secretary-General that recovery from this pandemic demands us to silence the guns and amplify the voices of women peace builders and to invest in public welfare rather than the instruments of warfare. To succeed, we must support the courageous work of grassroots and women-led organisations, as well as brave women human rights defenders. At a minimum, we must protect them from reprisals. Our recovery policies must also recognise the intersecting forms of discrimination, the discrimination that compounds vulnerability to violence, as Caroline so powerfully attested today. To build back better, we need to advance equality and participation for all, including those with disabilities, LGBTI plus persons, migrants and refugees, and members of racial and ethnic minorities. And let's remember, this Council has the means to act. We have put in place a robust framework to deal with conflict-related sexual violence over the last decade. And yet, compliance by parties to conflict is appallingly, shamefully low. 70% of parties listed in the Secretary-General's report have been appearing in the list for 5 years or more without taking corrective action. The fact is, we are failing in our responsibility if we do not ask ourselves why this is. This Council can and must do more with the tools at its disposal. It's our responsibility. To do what? We believe we must fully implement the recommendations of the IEG on women, peace and security. We believe that we should ensure that monitoring and early warning processes on CRSV are incorporated into all peacekeeping and special political missions that include protection of civilians' mandate. We believe we need to examine our use of targeted sanctions, specifically the designation criteria of conflict-related sexual violence and listing of sanctioned individuals. This is an underutilized tool to deter and punish sexual violence and conflict. We need to bring together our work on sanctions and on gender more systematically. Ireland supports the call by the Secretary-General to invite the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict to share information with sanctions committees, and we will play our part in advancing that effort. Sanctions are not our only tools for seeking accountability. As Special Representative Patton has said, the fight against CRSV is the fight against impunity. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are not somehow lesser crimes. They can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or constitutive acts with respect to genocide. Let's face it, the persistently paltry record of investigations, prosecutions, and convictions for conflict-related sexual violence is fundamentally a failure of political will. Today's debate, Mr. President, is not about some vague concept. It's about the reality of our work here on international peace and security. The ICC's recent conviction of Dominic Ongwen and its affirmation of Bosco Ntaganda's conviction are encouraging developments, as is the continued work of Colombia's transitional justice mechanisms, but they're all too rare, and we believe that this Council must reflect on its failure to make effective use of the accountability tools at its disposal, including the referral of situations to the ICC. We can draw a straight line from impunity for sexual violence in the past to the recurrence of violence in the future. In 2017, sexual and gender-based violence was a hallmark of the Tatmadaws operations in northern Myanmar and in Rakhine. Today, they turn their guns on civilians. As we heard from the SRSG today, deeply distressing reports of horrific sexual violence continue to emerge from Ethiopia, including abuses perpetrated by armed actors in the conflict in Tigray. The SRSG has spoken of acts that may amount to sexual atrocities. These and other violations must cease immediately. We call on all armed parties to the conflict to fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and end hostilities, which will also help to facilitate humanitarian access. We call on them to ensure their forces respect and protect civilian populations, particularly women and children, from all human rights abuses, and that they explicitly condemn all sexual violence. We welcome the announcement by the High Commissioner for Human Rights confirming plans for a joint investigation with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission into human rights violations in Tigray, including sexual violence. This is an urgent task to bring an end to ongoing violations, and it's also vital for accountability to bring perpetrators to justice, whatever their affiliation. We are in full support of the High Commissioner in this critical undertaking. Mr. President, as I conclude, the war correspondent Christina Lamb has noted the absence of women's names in war memorials. The stigma of rape in war belongs not to its victims, but to its perpetrators. The stories of survivors of sexual violence, mostly women, need to be told. Importantly, they need to be truly heard, but that's not enough. We must demand the prosecution of the crime of conflict-related sexual violence on an equal basis with other war crimes and crimes against humanity. The survivors of these crimes deserve nothing less than justice. They deserve redress. They deserve access to comprehensive survivor-centred services, including sexual and reproductive health. Above all, they're entitled to the right to participate on a full, equal and meaningful basis in public life. Mr. President, that would be a fitting memorial. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. And thank you to the Special Representative and our distinguished briefers for sharing your important insights. The courageous leadership of Dr. Mukwege and Mrs. Atim is truly inspiring and crucial. Thanks also to Mrs. Kajun. Norway commends you and your tireless work. President, conflict-related sexual violence is a violation of international humanitarian law and a violation and abuse of human rights, one which primarily affects women and girls, but also men and boys. It may also constitute a war crime or a crime against humanity. Crimes of this gravity cannot simply be accepted as a side effect of armed conflict. President, shortly after the adoption of Resolution 2467, the SGBV conference in Oslo brought together a wide range of actors, making hundreds of commitments to end SGBV in humanitarian crisis and conflict. Despite progress made, the recent Secretary General's report confirms that sexual violence continues to be deliberately used as a tactic of war, torture and terror. These documented incidents represent just the tip of the iceberg. The report paints a harrowing picture of sexual violence in the DRC, South Sudan and Tigray. Women were also specifically targeted for their activism, including in Afghanistan, Colombia and Yemen. We call on all parties to implement the Secretary General's recommendation. We particularly note the commitment by the government of Ethiopia to investigate the many accounts of brutal and systematic sexual violence in Tigray. Credible and independent investigations are essential. We therefore call for making full use of the support offered by the OHCHR and the Office of SRG Patten. President, it is imperative that conflict-related sexual violence is addressed in ceasefire and peace agreements, including in the definition of prohibited acts and in ensuring monitoring and implementation of commitments. We must turn commitments into compliance and resolutions into results. Resolution 2467 calls for strengthened focus on justice and accountability and a survivor-centered approach. We must ensure its full implementation by keeping the rights of survivors in all their diversity at the forefront. Support to survivors must be age and gender sensitive and include access to healthcare, sexual and reproductive health and rights, psychosocial support, and access to justice. We must ensure survivors' full, equal, and meaningful participation. We must also tackle intersecting inequalities and root causes. We condemn the targeting of people based on disabilities and actual or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. We are also appalled by the increase in CRSV against children. We reiterate that states carry the responsibility to protect women and children from rape and sexual violence. As chair of the Working Group for Children and Armed Conflicts, we call on our fellow council members to work to adopt strong and operational conclusions. President, we also need a more comprehensive, coordinated and targeted effort by peace operations in combating sexual violence. This is why we supported the production of the Policy and Handbook on Preventing and Responding to Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, which provides practical guidance to civilian, military, and police components. We also look forward to the first report on peacekeeping missions' implementation of CRSV mandates. Thankfully, we already have examples of best practice to build on, including the ongoing work of UNMISS in supporting the implementation of the National Action Plan on CRSV through capacity building and awareness raising. We are proud to count Norwegian personnel among the UN police team supporting the South Sudanese police in investigating sexual and gender-based violence. President, in closing, I would like to make 4 points on how Norway believes we should move forward. First, we must ensure a survivor-centered approach, one which demands the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and survivors in all diversity. Second, protection against conflict-related sexual violence must remain a key priority for this Council, and we must make use of all means at our disposal. Sexual violence as a standalone designation criterion for sanctions must be applied when applicable, and it should be a criterion in more sanction regimes. In this respect, we welcome the recent decision by the Yemen Sanction Committee to list individuals on the basis of sexual violence. Third, our effort must seek to prevent sexual violence. This includes fighting impunity. We must do more to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. We need an appropriate mechanism through which the Council can monitor compliance by parties to conflict. Finally, we must maintain the momentum from the Oslo Conference to make SGBV prevention and response a key humanitarian priority. This Council must be a strong voice. We cannot allow our political commitments being reversed by the COVID-19. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we thank Vietnam for convening the open debate on this important issue. We also thank the Secretary General for his report, SRSG Pramila Patten for her insights, and all distinguished briefers for sharing their views. Sexual violence and armed conflicts perpetrated by the state and non-state actors is a weapon used to subjugate the people. It fuels displacement, destabilizes and traumatizes communities, weakens governance, and imperils the opportunities for post-conflict reconciliation and stability. Despite the strong framework put in place by the Security Council over the past decade, the level of compliance by parties to the conflict remains alarmingly low. The gap between what is recommended and the reality in the field remains. Mr. President, in order to prevent the atrocities end the culture of impunity, and to rehabilitate and reintegrate the survivors, my delegation wishes to highlight the following points. First, it is vital for member states to develop a comprehensive legal framework in line with international standards to ensure the effective prosecution of sexual violence as a self-standing crime. National governments have the primary responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations on their territories, even if these are alleged to have been committed by non-state actors. Where required, the UN could assist member states in augmenting their capacities to deal with this issue. Second, member states should adopt a victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence and armed conflicts in line with Resolution 2467. States must ensure adequate funding for comprehensive, non-discriminatory and multi-sectoral assistance for victims of sexual violence, like medical, psychological, social, and legal services. Third, understanding the nexus between terrorism, financing of violent extremist groups, trafficking, and sexual violence in armed conflicts must inform Council action on this important matter. Fourth, the sanctions regimes and other targeted measures by the Council need to be strengthened to utilize their full potential to advance women's protection from sexual violence in situations of armed conflicts, including by listing individuals and entities involved in sexual violence against women in armed conflicts. Fifth, greater participation of women in conflict resolution and post-conflict reconciliation processes needs to be promoted to address deep-rooted inequality and subordination in the society. It is important to make this a precondition for any peace process to succeed. Sixth, mainstreaming of gender perspective in peacekeeping operations and increasing women's representation in peacekeeping are prerequisites for prevention and response. Seventh, and not the least, to promote synergy and effective coordination. It is imperative to avoid duplication in the working of the various UN organs. The issue of violence against women, including sexual violence, is discussed by other UN bodies, including at the Human Rights Council. Deliberations at the Security Council, therefore, should remain focused on such atrocities perpetrated in situations of armed conflict that threaten international peace and security. Mr. President, in 2017, Prime Minister Narendra Modi joined the Circle of Leadership on the prevention of and response to sexual exploitation and abuse in United Nations operations. India has also signed the Secretary General's Voluntary Compact against sexual exploitation and abuse. India has the distinction of sending the first all-women formed police unit contingent to Liberia in 2007. This unit not just managed criminality, deterred sexual and gender-based violence, and helped rebuild safety and confidence among the Liberian population, but operationalized the spirit of Security Council Resolution 1325 into action. These courageous Indian women patrolled Monrovian streets at night, taught Liberian women self-defense skills, conducted classes on sexual violence, maintained calm during the Ebola crisis, and devoted time and resources above and beyond the call of duty to protect the local communities. The legacy these Indian women peacekeepers left behind was the next generation of female Liberian leaders who are serving in the national police today. Major Suman Gavani, an Indian woman peacekeeper deployed earlier with UNMISS, was awarded the UN Military Gender Advocate for the year 2019 for her role in mentoring over 230 UN military observers and ensured the presence of women military observers in each of the mission's team sites. She also trained South Sudanese government forces and helped them launch their action plan to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. India welcomes the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy to increase the number of women peacekeepers. We also support increasing the deployment of women protection advisors for effective monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflicts-related sexual violence in the field. Mr. President, the burdening of the healthcare system and the economic fallout due to the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to put women and girls in armed conflict at even higher risk. Member states need to work together to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on sexual violence and armed conflicts and to preserve our hard-won progress in this field. Let me conclude by acknowledging the progress that has been achieved by the UN entities in monitoring, reporting, and listing the persistent offenders over the years. However, we need to continue focusing on closing the compliance gaps through a range of context-specific and inclusive actions. India reaffirms its commitments to actively contribute to a collective endeavor in effectively tackling sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Singping and the Grenadines.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. President, and for your work in convening this important meeting. We also thank our distinguished briefers, SRSG Patton, Dr. Mukwege, Ms. Atim, and Ms. Atinga Colin, for your thoughtful yet sobering briefings. The world has been gripped by intersecting crises and inequalities of epic proportions. These conditions have compounded the experience and increased rates of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, particularly against women and girls. Today, we recommit to ending the enduring inequalities, protracted conflict, and underdevelopment, which contribute to unconscionable levels of conflict-related sexual violence. At a time when St. Vincent and the Grenadines is confronted with a severe crisis of explosive volcanic eruptions, in addition to the social and economic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, we speak with an even deeper sense of pain, urgency, and commitment to addressing humanity's suffering. First, we commend the invaluable contribution of women's civil society, including, for example, the Women Protection Networks in Darfur, facilitating referrals and working to enhance the profiling of perpetrators of sexual violence. Further, we condemn any attacks against women's civil society networks. Secondly, underreporting resulting from fear of reprisals and shame remains an enduring challenge. With this in mind, we call for survivor-centered responses that prioritize women's and girls' desires at every stage of their trauma and recovery experience. Women's civil society and community organizations working to prevent and respond to sexual violence must be consistently funded and supported as they perform critical prevention, response, and recovery work with women, girls, and children. We recognize important actions to address conflict-related sexual violence, including the establishment of one-stop centers in South Sudan, specialized courts in all 34 provinces in Afghanistan, with 32 headed by women, the launch of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Helpline in the DRC by the United Nations, and of course the support of the Office of the SRSG on Sexual Violence in providing model legislative guidance on conflict-related sexual violence to national authorities. Notwithstanding important progress made, effective, comprehensive women and girl-led actions against conflict-related sexual violence remain elusive. This brings me to my third point, which is also related to the ongoing pandemic. With funding being divested toward pandemic mitigation measures, we urge authorities to designate sexual and gender-based violence response as central to pandemic recovery, planning, and funding. Displaced and refugee women and girls are among the most affected during the pandemic. We call for the inclusion or retention of key health and psychosocial services as national emergency response plans are adapted over time. Such plans must also include adequate socioeconomic recovery and reintegration support. Further, continued collaboration between regional organizations and the UN to support the development, operationalization, and adaptation of survivor-centered national action plans remain crucial. Diverse women and girls, civil society, and community organizers must occupy central roles in decision-making, budgeting, design, implementation, and the monitoring of compliance. The enduring effects of rape, trafficking, sexual slavery, and terrorism against women and girls by armed terrorist groups operating across borders further emphasize the need for national, regional, and multilateral cooperation. This includes joint-up cross-border monitoring and response capabilities. Ongoing regional and multilateral support to strengthen national accountability frameworks is necessary to not only end impunity, but also to ensure reparations for survivors. Finally, Mr. President, mandate authorizations, renewals, and implementation must prioritize gender analysis and gender justice with the requisite focus on participation, prevention, protection, relief, and recovery, including the consistent deployment of women protection advisors to all peacekeeping and political missions. Eliminating conflict-related sexual violence requires multi-level, multi-actor approaches that are tied to broader gender-responsive security and development actions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank all briefers for their presentations and, even more crucially, their daily tireless work. I also thank the Special Representative for the presentation of the annual report on conflict-related sexual violence and welcome the concrete recommendations therein. It is the 12th dedicated report by the Secretary General which clearly shows that conflict-related sexual violence, unforgivable and still unpunished, is widely used as a weapon of war across conflicts. We need to treat it systematically as such, picking up its early signs, countering its use, making it part of ceasefires and peace agreements, and making sure that those who commit it are punished and not included in amnesty provisions, ignoring its severity and impact. We also need to admit that the victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are victims and survivors of war. They deserve support and justice. We cannot address conflict-related violence, neither as states nor as the Security Council, without recognizing the need to ensure the full enjoyment of human rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights by women and girls. The Secretary General's report confirms that gender inequality is a root cause and a driver of sexual violence in times of conflict and peace. It turns women and girls into targets and means to wage war. It contributes to stigma, victim blaming, and underreporting of sexual violence. Gender inequality, compounded by harmful social norms, also means that the price for sexual violence remains low and or non-existent and results in gaps in legal frameworks and services for survivors. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these inequalities, even more so for women and girls in conflict situations, as the Council recognized in Resolution 2532. The Secretary General has drawn attention to the reports of sexual violence against women and girls in Tigray. We have acknowledged the Ethiopian government's willingness to collaborate with international human rights experts, and we urge it to guarantee an independent and credible investigation and unimpeded access of experts as well humanitarian aid organizations to assist the survivors of sexual violence. In Yemen, conflict-related sexual violence has been reportedly committed by all parties, including in detention and in IDP camps. We welcome the adoption of the Council Resolution 2564, which designated an individual based on actions related to the systematic detention, torture, and sexual violence against politically active women. We reiterate our call for accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, which is long overdue in Syria, as well as for violence committed by the Tatmadaw in Myanmar. As a member of the Security Council, Estonia will continue to underline the fundamental importance of human rights, including women and girls' human rights in combating conflict-related sexual violence. We continue to call for women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in peace processes, as well as COVID-19 recovery. We have and will continue to underline the absolutely crucial importance of accountability through domestic systems of justice or, if appropriate, through the International Criminal Court. Estonia continues its support to the team of experts, which in 2020 provided technical assistance to the prosecution and trial of Ntabo Ntaberi Sheka, redress and reparations for survivors are part of accountability. We support the designation and use of sexual violence as a standalone criterion for sanctions and the SRSG's briefings to the Security Council sanctions committees. We encourage all parties to conflict to adopt specific commitments to address conflict-related sexual violence. We continue to call for a non-discriminatory and rights-based approach to assisting survivors of sexual violence, respecting their diversity and needs. This includes the provision of comprehensive services, including psychological, legal, and sexual, and reproductive health services and livelihood support. We continue to support the mandating and deployment of women protection advisors and look forward to their deployment in Libya and Sudan. We see sufficient capacity and funding as key for the functioning of the monitoring and reporting arrangements. We will continue to call for the Council to speak up on reprisals and attacks, including targeted sexual violence against women active in public life, women human rights, and those providing assistance to survivors of sexual violence. Mr. President, the shadow that conflict-related sexual violence casts is long. Its memory is carried forward, and it can fuel endless cycles of violence. Bringing justice and addressing the rights and needs of its survivors is one step towards breaking this silence. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous remercions les intervenants dont les présentations nous interpellent sur une des conséquences les plus atroces des conflits. Des milliers de personnes souffrent de violences sexuelles inhumaines en temps de conflit, commises comme stratégie de guerre, de répression politique, de torture et de terreur. Et le rapport du secrétaire général sur la question vient confirmer les conséquences désastreuses de la pandémie de la COVID-19 sur l'incidence des violences sexuelles liées au conflit, notamment l'accès réduit à la justice et aux services de prise en charge, la fragilisation du système de contrôle et de surveillance et la réduction des ressources financières allouées. L'un des moyens les plus efficaces de lutter contre ces violences est la prévention, notamment l'accès à une éducation de qualité. Les attaques contre l'éducation et les écoles deviennent de plus en plus préoccupantes. Nous devons donc protéger l'accès à l'éducation, en particulier pour les filles qui, dans les pays touchés par les conflits, ont 2 fois moins de chances de scolariser que celles vivant dans les pays en paix. Elles sont également plus susceptibles de subir des violences sexuelles et sexistes sur les chemins de l'école. La déclaration présidentielle sur les attaques contre les écoles, adoptée par le Conseil en septembre dernier, sous la présidence du Niger, rappelle la nécessité de la prise en compte du risque accru de violences sexuelles contre les filles privées d'accès à l'éducation, celles en déplacement forcé et celles vivant dans les zones analysées dans des violences localisées, notant par ailleurs que les enfants touchés par un handicap sont particulièrement vulnérables. Nous voudrions attirer l'attention du Conseil et des États membres sur la situation de vulnérabilité accrue à laquelle sont confrontées les femmes et les filles qui subissent les effets croisés des conflits, des déplacements forcés, parfois exacerbés par les effets du changement climatique et la précarité économique qui pousse certains à la migration. À cet égard, le Niger réitère ses inquiétudes quant aux conditions de vie des migrants et des réfugiés interceptés en mer, débarqués en terre libyenne, où les femmes migrantes dans des centres de détention surpeuplés font face à des violations de toutes sortes. Au vu de cette situation, il est nécessaire de revoir la politique de débarquement en terre libyenne des migrants et des réfugiés interceptés en mer. Monsieur le Président, depuis quelques années, les pays du Sahel font face à une crise sécuritaire aggravée par plusieurs facteurs tels que la présence de groupes armés terroristes, la prolifération d'armes légères, l'insuffisance d'opportunités socio-économiques et les tensions intercommunautaires, entre autres. Les situations d'urgence, les crises humanitaires liées aux catastrophes naturelles et les déplacements de populations qui en découlent aggravent la vulnérabilité des femmes et des filles. Il a été constaté dans la région du bassin du lac Tchad que des groupes terroristes tels que Boko Haram procèdent à des enlèvements de filles et de femmes pour ensuite les intégrer de force dans les rangs des prisonniers de guerre et les utiliser comme esclaves sexuels ou comme bombes humaines. C'est le cas le 14 avril 2014, soit exactement 7 ans aujourd'hui, que Boko Haram a procédé à l'enlèvement massif de 276 filles à Chibok, dont beaucoup à jamais enlevées à leur famille, privées de cette quête du savoir qui les animait et soumises à des violences inimaginables. Dans un contexte marqué par l'insécurité, ce type d'incident grave a des conséquences sur la scolarisation des filles, avec un risque accru de déscolarisation qui les rend plus vulnérables au mariage précoce et forcé, aux grossesses précoces et autres violences basées sur les genres. Conscient de la nécessité d'une prise en charge holistique des survivantes et rescapées des violences sexuelles dans les zones les plus touchées par la crise sécuritaire, le Niger a créé des centres spécialisés pour la prise en charge d'un centre de transit et d'orientation avec des programmes de démobilisation et de réintégration adaptés aux enfants rescapés des groupes armés. Monsieur le Président, ma délégation soutient fermement que les États membres, tout comme le système des Nations Unies, doivent servir d'exemple dans la réponse aux questions de violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Récemment, suite aux allégations de violences sur 3 femmes par des soldats déployés dans la zone des 3 frontières, les autorités des pays concernés ont réagi promptement. Dès que ces faits ont été portés à leur connaissance, ils ont fait mener des enquêtes fiables et rapides, concomitamment avec la Commission nationale des droits humains et une mission conduite par le commandant du fuseau centre de la flotte G5 Sahel. Tout en rappelant que ces cas sont isolés, nous nous félicitons des mesures immédiates prises pour assurer les investigations, la protection des civils, la prise en charge des victimes, mais aussi l'application de mesures et sanctions disciplinaires à l'endroit des soldats incriminés. Cette collaboration tripartite ayant mobilisé la société civile, les communautés, les États et les services judiciaires pourrait servir d'exemple dans la mise en œuvre d'un système de réponse rapide dans plusieurs autres situations où, parfois, les allégations de violences sexuelles restent sans suite. La culture d'impunité sur les violences sexuelles, y compris à l'échelle du système des Nations Unies, notamment dans les zones touchées par les conflits, et ce, quels que soient les auteurs, doit cesser. Il y va de la crédibilité des missions et des valeurs fondamentales que nous défendons. Ceci est également une question de justice. Nous félicitons à cet égard l'engagement des hauts responsables de l'ONU sur les questions relatives aux droits des victimes et au changement de la culture institutionnelle avec une tolérance zéro aux violences sexuelles. Monsieur le Président, ma délégation voudrait émettre les recommandations additionnelles suivantes. 1. L'adoption par les États membres d'une approche axée sur les personnes rescapées, conformément à la résolution 2467, avec la mise en place ou le renforcement de l'assistance juridique et judiciaire, en plus des dimensions sanitaires, psychologiques, sociales et économiques. Assurer une présence adéquate des spécialistes de protection de l'enfance, en plus du déploiement de conseils en genre. De ce fait, l'approche axée sur les survivantes et les personnes rescapées doit être non seulement pluripartenaire, mais aussi pluridisciplinaire, avec des services accessibles et de qualité, prenant en compte les réalités socio-spécifiques et la manière dont les crises multiples amplifient les vulnérabilités de certains groupes. Troisièmement, la mise en œuvre de programmes efficaces à travers des données fiables et désagrégées. À cet effet, il faudrait renforcer le système de collecte de données avec les autorités locales et le rôle de la société civile, notamment les organisations locales de défense des droits humains. Pour conclure, nous devons briser le cycle de la double victimisation des rescapés, le silence, le tabou et la stigmatisation sociale. Et cela ne peut se faire sans action de proximité dans les communautés. Nous devons collectivement nous attaquer aux causes provenant des violences sexuelles, parmi lesquelles la discrimination sexiste, le manque d'opportunités économiques et les masculinités toxiques. L'accès à l'éducation de qualité, notamment dans les zones touchées par le conflit, demeure crucial. Nous devons nous servir de la crise actuelle pour aller vers une nouvelle ère plus juste, plus égalitaire et où les violences sexuelles liées au conflit seraient complètement éradiquées. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Niger for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас. Господин председатель, позвольте поблагодарить вас за организацию заседания, признателен также докладчикам за вклад в сегодняшнюю дискуссию. Совет Безопасности ежегодно собирается для того, чтобы обсудить меры против преступлений сексуального характера в вооруженном конфликте. Из уст ораторов звучат искренние выступления с осуждением таких преступлений. Утверждается общий настрой на решительную борьбу с этим отвратительным явлением. Секретариатом разрабатываются типовые законодательные положения и детальные планы. Привлекается серьезный экспертный потенциал. Задействуются силы и средства организации в международных миротворческих присутствиях и специальных политических миссиях. Проблема есть. Она осознается международным сообществом. Необходимость борьбы с этим злом разделяется всеми, без исключения, членами Совета Безопасности. Почему же тогда генеральный секретарь ООН в своих докладах из года в год, по сути, констатирует отсутствие прогресса в этих вопросах? Почему цельные, хорошо структурированные и продуманные рекомендации его спецпредставителя входят в противоречие с реальностью на местах? Что мешает, например, враждующим сторонам гарантировать всестороннее конструктивное участие женщин, девочек и жертв сексуального насилия в процессах принятия решений, как это предлагается в докладе? Ответ зачастую прост. Это само состояние войны. Состояние вражды и ненависти в обществе, нередко подогреваемое извне. Состояние, когда отсутствует право, справедливость, дееспособные институты власти. Когда прав тот, у кого есть оружие. Мы должны делать все, чтобы остановить конфликты, устранить их коренные причины, воссоздать устойчивое общество. Именно тогда такое общество способно побороть безнаказанность, положить конец насилию, в том числе сексуальному насилию. Господин председатель, мы приветствуем деятельность спецпредставителя генсекретаря госпожи Прамилы Паттен. Высоко ценим ее работу, направленную на укрепление национального потенциала, развитие диалога с религиозными и другими традиционными лидерами, решение проблем стигматизации жертв сексуального насилия и их реабилитации. Важно, чтобы гуманитарная работа ее офиса не ассоциировалась с политическими пристрастиями, не воспринималась как потакание одной стороне конфликта и замалчивание преступлений другой. В этой связи призываем составителей доклада с особой тщательностью подходить к списку сторон, в отношении которых имеются обоснованные подозрения в совершении актов сексуального насилия. Все подозрения по определению должны быть обоснованы. Факты проверены. Источники информации идентифицированы. Господин председатель, несмотря на дополнительные трудности, накладываемые пандемией, мы не теряем надежду на то, что принимаемые меры, в том числе и сегодняшние дебаты, будут способствовать искоренению насилия в отношении гражданских лиц, в том числе сексуального насилия, на благо международного мира и безопасности. Я благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi tout d'abord de saluer l'engagement du Viet Nam en faveur de la lutte contre les violences sexuelles dans les conflits. Je remercie également la représentante spéciale, ainsi que le docteur Mukwege et les autres représentants de la société civile pour leurs interventions. La France partage les préoccupations exprimées dans le rapport et dans les interventions prononcées aujourd'hui. Les violences sexuelles liées au conflit se poursuivent dans l'impunité, notamment dans le contexte de la pandémie. Je pense notamment aux situations dans le Tigré en Éthiopie, en République démocratique du Congo, en Syrie ou en République centrafricaine. Le temps n'est plus aux constats, mais aux actes. Notre responsabilité collective consiste à garantir la mise en œuvre de l'ensemble des résolutions pertinentes de ce Conseil. Nous devons aussi assurer le respect des engagements pris par les parties concernées. La France condamne fermement le recours aux violences sexuelles comme tactique de guerre et outil de terreur. Nous condamnons également tout discours sexiste, misogyne ou homophobe qui exacerbe les violences. Je souhaite insister sur 4 points. Tout d'abord, toutes les formes de violence doivent être réprimées. La pandémie a réduit l'accès aux services de police, de justice et de santé. Le non-dépôt de plaintes et l'impunité demeurent des problèmes majeurs. C'est notamment le cas en Syrie, où la France est résolument engagée pour que les auteurs de tels crimes soient punis. La France croit à l'importance de la justice, de la réparation et des garanties de non-répétition. Nous saluons le rôle de la Cour pénale internationale pour sa contribution à ce fléau et prenons note à cet égard de la récente condamnation en première instance de Dominique Ongwen en Ouganda. Nous devons également adopter une approche centrée sur les rescapés et garantir une prise en charge globale des survivants. Ceux-ci doivent avoir accès à un suivi médical, psychologique et social pour favoriser le retour à une vie normale. C'est pourquoi la France poursuit son engagement financier de 6,2 millions d'euros au Fonds mondial pour les survivantes de violences sexuelles créé par les prix Nobel de la paix, le Dr Mukwege et Madame Mourad. Nous devons en outre mettre un terme aux entraves à l'accès aux droits et à la santé sexuelle et reproductive. Nous regrettons la politisation de ces enjeux qui conduit à perdre de vue l'intérêt supérieur des femmes et des filles. La France finance au Tchad à hauteur de 5 millions d'euros un projet d'autonomisation des femmes par un meilleur accès à ces services et une prise en charge sanitaire et psychosociale. La protection de ces droits sera au cœur du processus du Forum Génération Égalité lancé à Mexico et qui se conclura à Paris du 30 juin au 2 juillet prochain. Enfin, il est nécessaire que ce Conseil fasse davantage. La France continuera de soutenir la prise en compte de ces violences dans les mandats, de promouvoir la mise en œuvre de ces des résolutions femmes, paix et sécurité et la mise à disposition de ressources adéquates pour les équipes sur le terrain. En outre, la mise sous sanction des auteurs de violences sexuelles est nécessaire et le Conseil de sécurité doit faire davantage en ce sens. Ce combat doit être mené sans relâche et sans compromis. La France s'y emploiera, en particulier dans la perspective du Forum Génération Égalité. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like at the outset to thank all briefers for their insightful comments and to particularly commend the inclusive approach in the selection of the briefers today. Conflicts always have a devastating impact on all civilians without exceptions. However, there is a need to recognize specifically the disproportionate impacts of conflicts on women and girls. First, as the report of the Secretary General indicates, women and girls are in many instances utilized as a weapon of war or of terrorism during conflict. Such systematic targeting aims at violating the dignity of women and girls by subjecting them to sexual and gender-based violence such as rapes, trafficking, and sexual slavery. Second, these crimes committed against them are often not recognized as a tactic of war or of terrorism, but rather as simple acts of violence, and therefore the perpetrators do not face proper accountability that reflects the seriousness of the crime. Third, access to justice and remedies is hindered largely due to the absence of gender-responsive services and to the prominence of negative social norms blaming victims and stigmatizing them. This reveals the multi-layered nature of violations against the survivors, which start with the conflict itself and carry out even in post-conflict settings due to the lack of accountability. And finally, women and girls are often marginalized from post-conflict peace processes, with only 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories in major peace processes around the world. For this reason, any post-conflict peace process is likely to overlook the particular vulnerabilities, grievances, and needs of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict settings, including the sexual and gender-based violence against them. Mr. President, first and foremost, the best way to eradicate conflict-related sexual violence is to put an end to conflicts themselves and to build peaceful and resilient societies. We welcome in this regard the recommendation contained in the Secretary General's report to immediately cease all acts of sexual violence in conflict consistent with Security Council Resolution 2532 presented by Tunisia and France and his call for a global ceasefire. Tunisia strongly believes in a survivor-centered approach. In this regard, we reiterate that survivors of conflicts-related sexual violence do not constitute a homogeneous group and that they require tailored measures and services and that respond to their different needs and contexts. Most importantly, we need to provide and sufficiently fund psychological, legal, and medical services that include sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as socio-economic opportunities to ensure the reintegration and empowerment of survivors. We also need to put an end to impunity by delivering justice to the victims and survivors that restores their rights and preserves their dignity. It is essential to put in place and strengthen robust national, legal, and judicial measures, as well as UN-targeted sanctions that reflect the seriousness of these heinous crimes. Tunisia is committed to put a stronger emphasis on conflict-related sexual violence committed by terrorist groups as a tactic of terrorism, which we included in the PRC adopted in January and which we will continue to advocate for during the ongoing review of the global counterterrorism strategy, as well as in in other upcoming processes for different subsidiary bodies of the Security Council. Mr. President, it is important to reflect on why sexual violence, among all things, is being weaponized during conflict. In fact, we see this phenomenon as deeply rooted in historical and structural gender inequalities and unequal power relations between men and women. Patriarchal and negative social norms increase the vulnerability of women and girls in the face of conflicts. Therefore, we can prevent conflict-related sexual violence by tackling its underlying drivers, by promoting gender equality and human rights, by bringing national legislations in line with international norms and standards, and by implementing the existing normative framework on women, peace, and security. Such exercise requires a whole of government and the whole of society approach that involves an active role and partnership with civil society organizations, local communities, feminist groups, girls and youth-led organizations, private sector, and all other relevant stakeholders to promote gender equality and the full, equal, effective, and meaningful participation and leadership of women and girls in all public and private spheres. It is of most importance to ensure the continuity of the necessary funding mechanisms within the UN system and to civil society sectors in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Vietnam. We would like to thank Achaji Patton for her insightful briefing. We would like also to thank other briefers for bringing their valuable experiences to the discussion today. Colleagues, over the years, sexual violence continues to occur in global conflict with traumatizing impact on the victims, particularly vulnerable women and girls. We are concerned about the tremendous suffering of victims from physical and psychological injuries, discrimination and social exclusion associated with sexual violence. Lacking access to education, livelihood, and economic opportunities, these victims are also easily subject to the stigmatization, human trafficking, and armed conflict and terrorist recruitments, which prolong the vicious circles of violence and sufferings. While the international community has given increasing attention and commitment to the issues, it is regrettable that the situation in the past year remain alarming and has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. As reflected by the report of the Secretary General, among others, gender-based inequality, which is the root causes and drivers for sexual violence in times of conflict, has been amplified. The pursuit of justice and redress has been further complicated, while new concerns on gender-specific protection have risen. Against this backdrop, we share many points raised by other members and would like to stress the following. First, a comprehensive perspective. We emphasize the need to take a comprehensive perspective and redouble our effort to prevent and respond to sexual violence in conflict. In this regard, timely assistance and access to services are of critical importance to victims of sexual violence. This may include healthcare, psychological and legal support, vocational training, employment opportunity, and socio-economic reintegration. And at the same time, measures aimed at addressing the root causes of sexual violence in conflict remain critical too. In this process, the consideration of a survivor-centered approach, as mentioned in the report of the SecGen, should always be in focus. Second, gender equality and women empowerment. Vietnam underscores the importance of promoting gender equality and women political, social, and economic empowerment. We recognize the links between sexual violence and gender inequality. The full and equal participation of women in decision-making and peace processes is a prerequisite to all prevention of conflict and sexual violence in conflict. This would ensure that national policies could adequately address the need and interests of the victim, raise greater awareness, and overcome stigma and discrimination. It is also important to enhance women's economic empowerment to assist victims in their recovery and reintegration. Third, collective effort. While states have the primary responsibility in this regard, the international community, particularly the UN agency, programs, and peacekeeping missions, can provide much-needed development assistance, capacity building, technical support, and training. We encourage the inclusion of conflict-related sexual violence prevention and response in mandates, authorization, and renewal of peace operations, as well as the accelerated development of women protection advisors to peace operations and offices of United Nations were mandated. Women protection advisors who work closely among community on the ground should be provided with necessary resources to fulfill their tasks in peacekeeping operation. We also encourage the international community to take a united and collective response to effectively implement existing normative frameworks on the women, peace and security agenda and on the prevention and response to the conflict-related sexual violence. Victims of sexual violence can become resilient survivors when they are supported and empowered. Vietnam stands ready to engage with member states and the United Nations relevant agency in this endeavor. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before closing, I would like to thank once again all the distinguished participation who joined us today, and of course, all the briefers to join us today. And I would like also to thank the member states and regional groups which have so far submitted written statements on the subject of today's discussion. Statements that are received by the end of today will form part of the compilation of statements from this meeting, and we look forward to receiving more. The meeting is adjourned.